mean, it's also UTC, so that's nice to have that.
Annabelle, when's Amazon going to have a Kindle that's USB-C charging? Isn't this fun that I can ask these questions now?
I think you have to ask somebody in the Kindle org about that.
You work at Amazon, don't you?
I work for AWS, which technically means yes, but you know how that works.
Yeah, so
I come as some shock, I know, but Amazon is a large company. You don't know all of what's going on. Imagine that. Sometimes we have
because you've got the USB, yeah.
contradictions.
Right.
Has anyone not filled in the blue, signed the blue sheet? Oh, there's somebody hiding behind the post. Intentionally or unintentionally? There's lots of chairs right up here at the front of the class. Well, why don't we get started? There's Noel. And if anybody thinks of something that I forgot to do, feel free to remind me. Here's an agenda. Anybody have feedback on the agenda? Of course, Mike has left the room. Would you like to go first, Annabelle? Or do you want to wait for?
It's contrary to the agenda.
Okay.
Well, this is part of the agenda review. So
Yeah.
we're changing the
Yeah,
agenda.
we're in the agenda review part of the agenda, and now we're proposing to change the order of the agenda.
Second.
Okay. Well, I think we might have to wait a bit because I managed to not get. I
Hold it up to the camera.
What happened here?
It's sad that I have to go to Facebook to
Guys, it was up there on the agenda 15 seconds ago.
I know, and that was 15 seconds in the past.
The mouse scrolls the wrong way, which is very confusing for me.
Oh, it's linked in the agenda. Oh. It's the pen and rectangle icon.
Maybe, but I don't know. No, here we go. That might work.
Whoa! Yes, it is on now. Okay. Wow. Okay. My name is Annabelle Beckman. I'm here to talk about subject identifiers for security event tokens. Shockingly, exactly what is on the slide. Okay, I'm going to need you to scroll because that is a big no. I'm just going to have our wonderful chair here scroll for me. Okay, subject identifiers. We've been through this before, but for anybody who's unfamiliar with this work, the goal is to define lightweight schemas for the various ways that we might identify a subject, be it by email or phone number or issuer and subject pair or any number of other things. So the spec defines the format for defining these schemas, and then defines a few of them in the spec itself, and defines a IANA registry for that work. Next. Just to help add some clarity, here's an example of one of these things in action in a risk subject event, security event token. You see it in this particular example, we have a subject identifier of the issuer subject type. It has a subject type field saying what type it is, and then it has a couple of claims, the meaning of which are defined in the spec. So where are we at? Just published draft number 4. It is in use in the risk spec that is being worked on in OpenID Foundation's risk working group. Google and Amazon are both working on implementations and interoperability on this. It's pretty much where we've been at for a while. Next. A couple of 2 small updates and 1 more significant update here. There was some concern over identifier correlation and should we have some text in this document about that, so we added that to privacy considerations. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that. You can look at the draft and read the paragraph. Next.
Has anybody read the latest draft?
Okay.
Did anyone read the draft before that? Thanks. Does anyone have questions about this or would like Annabelle to go on? We have a fair amount of time for the session. If there's not interest, we'll continue on.
Go ahead next. The next notable change is that we added language to prohibit nesting aliases. What that means is we added this type, subject identifier type called aliases. The purpose of this is to allow you to include multiple identifiers for the same subject. So this is particularly useful in cases where it's unclear how the intended audience of say, set is identifying the subject or knows how to identify the subject, and so you want to send a couple of identifiers. The sort of canonical example where this is useful is in cases of like OpenID Connect Federation on the web, where an issuer, an OpenID provider might send an ID token with email address and issuer and subject and maybe phone number and who knows what else. Ideally, the client is using issuer and subject to identify the subject, and they're storing that in their database, but they don't always do that. Sometimes they just map based on email address. We don't want them to do that, but that's what people do in practice. So this gives a way for the issuer, if they're sending a set, to include multiple identifiers so that the recipient is going to be able to figure out who they're talking about, even if they didn't do the right thing. So that's what alias is for. This update just makes it so you're not going to have aliases nested in aliases, nested in aliases, have this like nested list structure that doesn't make any sense and doesn't have any meaning. So we're just going to say, let's not do that. Next.
Did you? Ben's walking over to the mic.
Oh, do we have a Jabber comment?
We do have a Jabber comment. Bjorn Hyum asks if there's a reason why the claim value for the phone number is just phone as opposed to like phone underscore number, because a phone might just be like the physical hardware object that has its own identifier as opposed to the number itself.
So just to make sure I understand the question, we're asking why is the attribute name phone used instead of phone underscore number?
Yeah.
Or are we talking about the name for the subject identifier type? Or maybe we're talking about both.
We might be talking about both, but
Okay.
it sounded like the attribute.
Okay, that's a fair question. The answer is because phone is shorter. But if there are concerns about ambiguity there, I don't see a compelling reason not to change that. If there's a legitimate ambiguity concern, then sure.
To this point about existing practice, the OpenID Connect user info claim is phone_number.
That's a good reason to change it. Any other questions on this before we move on to the third and final change? Oh, nice, slide got screwed up. Okay, so this one is a little bit more substantial. There was some discussion last meeting about the need for a JOT claim for including a subject identifier in a JOT. The idea here is that JOT defines the subclaim, which is defined just as a string, which is great for OpenID Connect, where like that's defined in OpenID Connect. That's how you identify a subject. But it's not so great in other scenarios where you have a more complex representation of a subject. So what we did in this draft is we added this this definition for this sub_ID JOT claim. The language I have there is copied from the text. It's a subject identifier that identifies the principal that is the subject of the JOT. And that underlined portion there is copied from the definition of the subclaim in JOT itself. So the intention here is that both of these claims, sub and sub-ID, are going to point to the same subject, the same principle. You can't have one pointing to one thing and one pointing to another. That would be that would be a violation of the spec. And there's language in the spec to that effect. So at the bottom here, we have an example of kind of the simple case of I just have a sub-ID. On the next couple slides, I've got some other examples of how sub and sub-ID interact with one another. So a JOT can have sub, it cannot have sub, it can have sub-ID, it cannot have sub-ID. Both of these can exist at the same time. You can have a JOT with neither of them. If they both exist, as I said earlier, if they're both present in the same JOT, they have to point to the same principle. If you put sub and sub-ID in the same JOT, you are making a statement that these identifiers point to the same principle. That said, that doesn't mean they have to necessarily have the same value. For example, in this example, I have one where the issuer is using an email address to identify the subject in the subclaim. Now, I have a typo in there. The intention here, what that subject type should say is email. In the sub-ID claim, they are specifying an email subject identifier, but it is a different email for the subject. So effectively, the issuer here is saying both of these email addresses actually point to the same subject.
There wasn't a new type of subject type called account.
No, we do have a new type of subject type, excuse me, an account subject identifier type that was added in version 3, I believe, at Mike's suggestion, that uses account URIs.
So this one could have been that you could have had subject type account, and then the L value of the next line would be account.
That would be the next slide. Yes. So another option is you could have completely different types that you're using in each of these fields. In this case, again, the subclaim is using an email address. The sub-ID claim is identifying the subject by an account URI for some particular service.
Ben Kaduk, just for myself. So phrasing this like, the issuer is making an assertion that the principal of the subject, or the principal identified by the subject and the principal identified by the subject ID are the same principal. That sort of gives me a little bit of pause, because now when I receive that assertion, am I allowed to use that assertion and to use that information only in the context of processing this JOT or this yeah, this JOT? Or am I allowed to use that in arbitrary contexts, completely unrelated?
That would be subject to the data sharing agreements and privacy agreements that you have with the transmitter of that set. Any other questions on that before we move on? I think I've got another couple slides on this particular piece.
Do you want to maybe elaborate why that's important?
Sure. So the question was, if a transmitter is, by including sub and sub ID in a JOT, if that's making an assertion that those two identifiers point to the same principal, then the recipient of that JOT then can correlate those two identifiers basically and say, okay, I have records for the sub, I have records for sub ID. I know these now relate to the same principal. That is something that, governing that or regulating that, I think, is something outside the scope of the spec. But the spec that's going back to the identifier correlation language that was added. That's where we try and address those concerns and point out that, hey, if you are sharing structures that have multiple subject identifiers in them, make sure you're only doing that in cases where it's going to be okay for you to, for that recipient to know that those two identifiers relate together. That's why the ID token example that I gave earlier is a good one, because there the issuer knows that they've previously sent these identifiers to the recipient. So they know if the recipient can already correlate those. So sending them together in another context doesn't give the recipient more information. So another context where this sub-ID claim gets a little interesting is when we think about the interplay between the issuer of the JOT and the issuer in the issuer/subject identifier type. These values may or may not be the same. It is possible for a JOT to be issued by entity A, but use a subject identifier where the issuer is entity B. And a good example of this is shown here, where in this case we have a JOT being issued by a client, and they're using the issuer subject identifier type to indicate that the subject is defined relative to the issuer. So we can imagine this happening in an OpenID Connect relationship where the issuer has provided some subject identifier via an ID token. The client wants to communicate some information back up to the issuer via a JOT. The only shared identifier they have is the one that the issuer communicated in the ID token. It would be incorrect to just take that subject from that ID token and put it in the JOT the client is sending, because then it would say issuer is client and subject is this identifier that's defined relative to the issuer, which would be incorrect. So this gives us a way around that problem, gives us a way to clearly specify that we have one entity that's issuing this JOT, but we're identifying it using an identifier issued from, in this case, actually the recipient. So at this point, I think we have one concern raised about phone number, but other than that, we're looking for feedback on subject ID, and if there's anything else people think is missing from the spec. At this point, we don't have any other open items right now, so open to feedback there.
Brian Campbell of Ping. As the one who had actually originally raised the question about whether or not to do a claim here, I saw this was added, read through it. I like it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great.
The only one question I did have is, and I don't know that it's germane here, but I think that the risk working group uses subject spelled out throughout like all their messages. And I honestly don't know if they're using it as a top level claim or like more nested stuff. And if there's any potential issue between a name mismatch there.
Right. So the risk working group defines a subject claim within the event payload. So it's not at the JOT level.
So
That could arguably be replaced by sub ID and shift that up to the JOT level. That's something that the working group hasn't really looked at, hasn't really considered.
but there's no inherent conflict then anyway, since there wouldn't, I guess there wouldn't be, but it's
Right. There's
kind of a no-op.
Right. I believe the risk spec already says that the subject of the event or set might say that actually, that the subject of the event and the subject of the set are the same. So there shouldn't be any conflict there. It would just be another case of the subject specified in the event payload points to the same. If there is a sub ID, it points to the same principle as that. I think one of the strategies that was discussed or patterns that was discussed within set was that specs that are profiling the set should, go hog wild within the event payload, but kind of stay away from the JOT level of the set, the kind of container. So for that reason, it may make sense for risk to keep their subject in the event payload.
Yeah, it's good enough for me. I was more just curious.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions or feedback? All right.
So Brian joined us and Brian did read it. So the people that have read it, there's Brian, anybody else that's read it?
I think Phil raised his hand.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay. From a process point of view, Ben, should I go and see whether people are ready to put this to a last call to the list or? Okay. Anyone opposed to it going to the last call to the list? No one? Can I get some people to volunteer to review it? So we've got a number of other people who have read it. Mike?
And get a couple more.
I will try, but I will not promise.
If I periodically poke you,
Are you
maybe?
going to type that into
That is
the?
actually helpful.
Yeah. Will you type that in the minutes?
Yes.
I'm just going to leave that one alone. Anything else, Annabelle?
Nope, that's all I got for this.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mike, are you ready?
Ready as I'll ever be. High praise.
Say what you're ready for.
Indeed. Well, I intend to use the rest of the time with this presentation, but we'll see how it goes. Next. So this is a slide that I've had for about a year. What is the poll draft? It's a counterpart to the push draft, enabling it to be used in contexts where you can't use push. Next. So what's happened since we last met our heroes in Prague? We published a new revision where I did what I said what I would do, which was go through the push draft, find text that appeared to be applicable to the poll draft and either incorporate it directly if it was descriptive, or if it was normative, I changed to reference it rather than duplicate it. So we finished aligning the descriptive text. There were no normative changes. Next. So this is how I intend to use the rest of the time. This is my last slide. I believe we're ready for working group last call, but that's a decision of the chairs and the working group.
Has anyone read the draft that Mike pushed out 2 weeks ago? Okay, Annabelle? Sorry, did I see anybody else? People hiding behind anybody? No?
Not much actually changed, but there were some normative references made to the poll draft rather than duplicating text.
Anyone opposed to calling a last call on the list for this? No? Okay. On the subject identifier, Annabelle, you're going to make a change of the label? Okay. When can you have that pushed out? Right away, soon?
Yeah, once updates unlock.
They should have.
You're unlocked now.
Yeah. Okay. So we get that right away. We can call last call on the last two items.
Excited.
Yeah. Woohoo. Okay. Did you have anything else, Mike?
I guess I'll relinquish the time.
So the last item on our agenda was to see if there's any other work that people have proposed for this working group. No? Well, assuming that nothing happens and that our last calls go smoothly and people respond on the list, I don't know that we even need a session next time.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like we're in pretty good shape. I know that the push draft has been with me for longer than it should have, a couple months, but I had a pretty busy personal life, so all of my IETF time was like working on the telechat prep, and so I haven't gotten much in the publication requested documents from the working groups, but I'm back and I'm catching up on that. So I think I will get to the push in probably another few weeks and then start getting things moving again. So
Okay, great.
sorry it's been taking
Because
so
when you
long.
get to that, we'll probably have the poll and the subject all ready for you.
Yeah, it should be
And then you-
nicely queued up. I can have them both right there, and I can do the side by side, which would be actually quite nice.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Any other items? Any other business for the meeting? If not, I'll conclude the meeting. What's the official word? End it, conclude? Adjourn. Okay. Adjourn does sound official. Okay. The chair adjourned the meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Alexa, adjourn the meeting.
Last job. Anybody need a blue sheet?
Oh, does everyone sign the blue sheet?
So should I send the notes to seconded chairs then? So I had to look at the names and see how many elements there are.
It's just two of everything,
Yeah, so
except the B.
you should just double the B
I thought about it.
I know that.
It could irritate me that it's not. On the other hand, as it is, the letters reflect the value
Oh, you've got
Symmetric pattern.
Yeah, and you've got palindromes on either side.
Exactly.
That is kind of.